Here's what nobody told you was possible 2 weeks ago, and it's happening right now. The most powerful military in human history, having just launched a war on Iran alongside Israel, is now posting on social media asking China to help it out, not in a diplomatic cable, not through back-channel negotiations. On Truth Social, Donald Trump, the president, who spent his first term calling China an existential enemy, the man who launched trade wars and threatened tariffs on every ally in sight, that man is now personally appealing to Beijing to send warships. Let that land for a second. Trump posted on Truth Social asking China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK to send warships to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and safe. NBC News, this is not a presidential request. This is a president who started a war without a plan for. What happens when that war goes sideways? And it has gone sideways in ways that the people around him apparently never seriously modeled. Because here's the thing. The Pentagon and the National Security Council significantly underestimated Iran's willingness to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to U.S. military strikes. CNN, that's not my characterization. That's what multiple sources familiar with the planning told CNN. The people who built this operation failed to fully account for the most obvious, most historically predictable Iranian countermove available. And now, on March 14th, transit activity through the Strait of Hormuz fell to zero. No AIS-confirmed crossings recorded in either direction. Windward, zero. The world's most important oil choke point, zero. I'm Rachel Maddow, and tonight we're going to tell you the full story of how this happened, who knew what, when they knew it, what Iran actually did that stunned Washington, and why Donald Trump is now in the strange position of asking his adversaries for a lifeline. Because this story, this three-way chess game between Washington, Tehran, and the rest of the world is the story of this moment, and you need to understand every piece of it. Let's start at the beginning, not February 28th, when the bombs fell. Let's start earlier because context is everything here. On April 12, 2025, Iran and the United States began a series of negotiations aimed at reaching a nuclear peace agreement following a letter from President Trump to Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Trump set a 60-day deadline for Iran to reach an agreement. Wikipedia, that deadline passed, and what followed that failure set in motion everything we're living through now. After the deadline passed without an agreement, Israel attacked Iran, igniting a war between the two countries. Israel's attacks targeted Iran's top military leaders and nuclear scientists. Following the attacks, Iran pulled out and suspended nuclear talks indefinitely. Wikipedia. But Iran didn't stay down. That's the part that matters. The talks eventually resumed in early 2026 after large-scale protests inside Iran. There was a window, a genuine diplomatic window, and then it closed again. Not because diplomacy was impossible, but because the Trump administration pressed Iran to completely dismantle its nuclear and missile programs, a demand that Iran refused. Arms Control Association. Now, I want to pause here and be transparent with you. There are people who will tell you that Iran was simply stalling, that they never intended to negotiate in good faith. Defense Secretary Hegseth made exactly that argument. He said Iran was not negotiating, but stalling, buying time to reload their missile stockpiles and restart their nuclear ambitions, and that the Trump administration bent over backwards for real diplomacy, offering pathway after pathway to peace. NBC News. That's the administration's position. You should know it. But here's what the evidence also shows. The June 2025 U.S. attacks severely damaged Iran's major uranium enrichment facilities, but not its resolve to retain a nuclear program or its nuclear know-how. Arms Control Association, bombs can destroy buildings. They cannot destroy knowledge. That is not my editorial opinion. That is the Arms Control Association's assessment published just weeks ago. So going into February 2026, here's the board. Iran battered but unbroken, the U.S. and Israel planning something bigger, and a set of assumptions in Washington about what Iran would and wouldn't do in response Those assumptions were wrong. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel initiated coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Wikipedia, the killing of Khamenei. And let that register, the man who had led the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, gone Washington, it seems, believed that would be the decisive blow, that without its leader, Iran would fracture or fold. What actually happened was different. In response, Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone attacks on U.S. military bases, Israeli territory, and other Gulf states, while its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the Strait, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. Wikipedia. Starting on March 4, 2026, Iranian forces declared the Strait closed, threatening and carrying out attacks on ships attempting to transit Congress.gov. And within days, oil prices, which had been around $71 a barrel before the strikes, broke the $100 per barrel mark. USNI News, 20% of the world's daily oil supply, strangled by a country that had just lost its supreme leader and had its nuclear facilities bombed twice. That is the stunning part. That is what Washington didn't plan for. Not just that Iran would close the Strait, but that a severely damaged Iran could close it effectively and hold it closed. Let me give you the numbers, because they matter. 15 million barrels of crude and 5 million barrels of other oil products remain stranded in the Gulf every day. CNN, the International Energy Agency, confirmed those figures. At least 22 vessels had been attacked in and around the Gulf since the fighting began. Congress.gov, 5 crew members killed. Insurance premiums made the route functionally unnavigable, even for ships that wanted to try. And here's the detail that I find most revealing of all. While the Strait remains almost entirely closed to Western-aligned shipping traffic, Iranian oil is still passing through, according to several marine intelligence trackers. CNN read that again. Iran's oil moves. Everyone else's doesn't. Tehran isn't just closing the Strait. It is operating the Strait selectively, punishing its enemies while keeping its own arteries open. That is not the act of a crumbling regime. That is the act of a state that understood its leverage better than the people attacking it did. Now enter the new supreme leader. On March 9th, Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the killed supreme leader Ali Khamenei, was appointed as Iran's new supreme leader. CNBC, in his very first public statement, made Washington's problem considerably worse. Khamenei said the closure of the Strait of Hormuz must continue as a tool to pressure the enemy, and that all U.S. military bases in the Middle East should close immediately, warning that those bases will be attacked. CNBC. Oil prices extended gains the moment those words were translated. Now, here's where this story gets genuinely complicated, and where I want to make sure I'm being precise with you about what is confirmed versus what is analysis. The Trump administration's messaging on this war has been, to put it charitably, inconsistent. Trump administration officials gave sometimes conflicting takes on the operation's goals in language that evolved in real time. NBC News on February 28th, the message was no nuclear weapons. By March 2nd, Defense Secretary Hegseth was saying the regime had changed and the world was better for it. Language that sounds like regime change. And then hours later, clarifying that it was not a regime change war, not regime change, but also the regime did change. And both of those things were said within hours of each other by the same administration. That contradiction is not a communication error. It is a strategic confusion. And it matters enormously for what comes next, because Iran, China, Europe, everyone watching this is trying to figure out what the United States actually wants. And the answer, based on public statements, seems to be, we're not sure yet. Which brings us back to that Truth Social post. Trump called on China France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK to send warships to the Strait, saying he hoped they would contribute to keeping it open. NBC News, his follow-up post said the countries that receive oil through Hormuz must take care of that passage. This is a significant moment, and I want to explain why. Trump is not asking allies for diplomatic support. He is asking countries, including China, which buys Iranian oil and has explicitly advised its citizens to leave Iran for their safety, to commit naval assets to a conflict that Washington started without consulting any of them. The IRGC's Navy chief responded to Trump's appeal by saying, Americans falsely claimed the destruction of Iran's Navy. Then they falsely claimed the escorting of oil tankers. Now, they're even asking others for backup forces. Al Jazeera, that is Iran's new Supreme Leader's Navy chief, mocking the President of the United States on a public platform. That is where we are. And there is a reason Trump needs help. And it is a reason his administration has been reluctant to state plainly. While it's technically possible to create the conditions for some ships to pass through the Strait within days or weeks, restoring long-term sustained security to the Strait could take months. CNN, not days, months. Top U.S. General Dan Kane refused to commit to escorting vessels, and Energy Secretary Chris Wright noted that the Navy was not yet capable of escorting vessels and could likely only do so by the end of the month. CNN. Not ready. The United States Navy, the most powerful naval force on Earth, is not yet ready to guarantee passage through a 1-mile wide strait. So what is Trump actually doing when he posts asking China for warships? He is trying to solve a military problem with social media. He is hoping that the optics of a multinational coalition will either calm oil markets or convince Tehran that the pressure will mount. One expert told Al Jazeera it doesn't seem like the administration had a plan for the Strait of Hormuz to be closed, and that the appeal looked like a desperate move in an information campaign to calm markets. Al Jazeera. Meanwhile, the Europeans and Chinese have their own calculations to make. China gets roughly 40% of its oil from the Persian Gulf. Every day the strait stays closed. That is a direct economic hit to Beijing. But China also buys Iranian oil. China also has a strategic interest in demonstrating that American unilateral military action has consequences. Beijing watching Washington scramble for allies after starting a war without a coalition. That is, not without some satisfaction. In Chinese strategic thinking, the Europeans are in a similarly awkward position. France, Germany, and the UK, the original signatories of the 2015 nuclear deal, alongside the US, have long urged diplomatic solutions. Wikipedia, they are now being asked to send warships to clean up the aftermath of a decision they had no part in making, to protect a strait whose closure, they warned, could result from exactly this kind of military action. This is what going it alone looks like when it doesn't go as planned. Let's talk about what happens next, because there are a few different roads from here, and they lead to very different places. The first scenario, and this is the one the administration is betting on, is that Iran blinks the military pressure, combined with an international naval coalition forming around the strait, convinces Tehran that the economic cost of the closure is ultimately too high. Iran allows limited reopening, oil prices ease, and negotiations restart from a position of mutual exhaustion. The U.S. position remains that it needs to see Iran's uranium-secured Axios 450 kilograms of 60% enriched material, enough for more than 10 nuclear bombs. If Iran agrees to transfer or destroy that stockpile, a deal becomes possible. The second scenario is escalation. Trump has already threatened that if Iran interferes with free passage through Hormuz, it will be hit 20 times harder. Iran's new supreme leader has said the strait stays closed and U.S. bases will be attacked. Those are two maximalist positions pointed directly at each other. If either side moves before the other blinks, the conflict expands in ways that draw in more countries, push oil prices higher, and make a negotiated exit exponentially harder. The third scenario, the one I think analysts are underweighting, is strategic stalemate. Approximately 400 vessels are currently anchored in the Gulf of Oman, holding position near the Strait, waiting. Windward shipping operators are not immediately rerouting globally. They are waiting to see if some controlled transit regime emerges. If that wait extends from weeks to months, the economic pain globalizes. Gas prices in the United States, energy costs in Europe, supply chains in Asia, all of it tightens. And at that point, the political pressure on Trump is not just about Iran, it is about the American economy. Here is my analytical read, and I want to be clear. This is my read, not established fact. But the administration launched this operation believing that decapitating Iran's leadership and destroying its nuclear facilities would create conditions for a rapid deal. What they found is that the strikes severely damaged Iran's facilities, but not its resolve. Arms Control Association Iran still has nuclear know-how. It still has the Strait, and it has a new supreme leader who is, in his very first statement, more hardline than his father. And it has a global leverage point, the world's most critical energy choke point, that no amount of air power can simply bomb open. That is not a defeated country. That is a country that was hit hard and decided to hurt back in the one way it knew the other side hadn't fully prepared for. So what do you watch for in the days ahead? Watch China's response to Trump's appeal. If Beijing sends warships, it signals that economic self-interest has overridden its desire to let Washington stew in the consequences of its own decisions, and it changes the military math at the Strait. If China declines or stays vague, Trump's coalition collapses, and the pressure falls entirely on U.S. naval forces. Watch the oil price. At one point, oil broke $100 per barrel. USNI News, if it climbs significantly higher and holds there, the domestic political pressure on the administration intensifies rapidly. Americans feel $5 or $6 gas immediately. That is not an abstraction. Watch Iran's nuclear stockpile, the 450 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that Iran holds, convertible to weapons grade within weeks, is the central variable in every negotiation scenario. Axios, where that material goes, who controls it. Whether it is transferred, destroyed, or hidden, that is the actual end state question underneath all the noise about the Strait, and watch for back-channel signals. Wars that cannot be won quickly by either side typically end through negotiations that begin before the shooting stops. Oman mediated the earlier rounds of U.S.-Iran talks. Qatar has played a role. Russia proposed moving Iran's enriched uranium to Moscow as part of the deal. Wikipedia Trump turned it down. But that proposal existing at all tells you the diplomatic universe is still moving, even as the military one escalates. Here's the one thing I want you to take away from tonight. What Iran did, closing the Strait of Hormuz after being bombed, after losing its supreme leader, after having its nuclear sites struck twice, was not the act of a country being defeated. It was the act of a country that understood its own leverage and used it with precision. So you can agree or disagree with Iran's politics, its governance, its leadership. None of that changes this fact. It found the pressure point that hurt, and it pressed it. Washington didn't model that seriously enough. Not the Pentagon, not the NSC, and now a president who campaigns on strength and deal-making is asking China on social media to come bail him out. That is the story, and it's not over. If this gave you context you couldn't find anywhere else tonight, drop the word informed in the comments. Tell me which country you think is holding the most leverage right now, US, Iran, China, or someone else entirely. I want to see what you think. Stay with this story. It is moving fast, and the next 72 hours could change the entire trajectory of this war.